Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Visibility Era, the podcast. Today, we have an award winning podcast host that I personally love, Les from The Balanced Black Girl. She is a podcast host, she's a speaker, a content creator. She talks about all things wellness, beauty, lifestyle. And she came into my awareness because I pitched one of my clients to her shows, and then I got obsessed with her show, which I didn't tell you. And I was on walks listening to the different podcast episodes. And I just love the way you curate a conversation. So thank you so much for being here today.
Oh my God, thank you for having me. What a nice introduction. I'm always so curious, like how people find my show. So that's nice to hear.
It was actually kind of perfect. When I started listening to your show, it was an episode about growing a podcast, and we had just kind of started really shifting our focus to our podcast. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. I'm going to listen to this. I was actually voice noting you, Bridget, a bunch of tips from her show, which I may have mentioned or not, but
Well,
so
we'll have
amazing.
to go back over them today
Yeah.
on this episode.
Today in
Perfect.
this episode, we'll go over them. So, Les, can you start with just telling us about your journey, like how you got into podcasting? I feel like you are the GOAT. I just learned what that meant. I had no idea what it meant recently with podcasting.
Yeah, people think that I must have had some, long-term interest in podcasting before I started, and that wasn't the case at all. I was a pretty early adopter when it came to listening to podcasts. I started listening to podcasts in maybe 2013, 2014, and always loved listening, but hadn't ever thought about having my own until the day I got the idea for my show. And literally the day I got the idea for Balanced Black Girl, I started working on it. I ordered a microphone that day, started building the website that day, went down this giant YouTube, Google rabbit hole to figure out how the heck to start a podcast. And the show launched 10 days later. So I just got the idea and fully jumped in.
Wow, that is so impressive. Can I ask you do you know what your human design is? We're like little wellness nerds
Oh,
over here.
I love human design. I'm a 5/1 manifesting generator.
Oh, fun. I feel like MGs move so fast. When they get an idea, they're like, boom.
Yep. Just frantic, just going all in.
I love that. I'm a 3-5 generator, so we have that 5 line in common. I'm very curious about when you first started the podcast to what it is today. Like, what was your tech like? Because some people don't start because they're like, "Oh, I don't know where to get a microphone," or whatever it is that comes into our minds. Like, what has the change been over the years for you?
Oh, it's been a huge change. I mean, my tech at the beginning was literally terrible. Also, back when I started podcasting, I was quite literally the brokest I had ever been, making the least amount of money ever in my life. And so I bought like the Yeti Snowball microphone on Amazon, which is terrible. So many people start with it and it's just horrible sound quality. I was recording in GarageBand. It was not fancy at all. I was editing myself in GarageBand. It wasn't good, but it got started. You almost need to start when it's not good so that you can get better. Now I record in studio like 98% of the time. So I'm using studio equipment that I'm not running. But yeah, for several years, it was just like the best that I could do and afford. And anytime I could upgrade and get better, I would. But you have to start from somewhere in order to get better.
We always say that starting is just, it doesn't matter. If the tech's not perfect, it's not that big of a deal, or whatever things and excuses that we give ourselves. So I give you a lot of credit for starting, and also starting when, like, I mean, your podcast seriously boomed. You've been doing this for a while. So I give you lots of credit. Speaking of, can you take us down memory lane of what it looked like when you started your podcast? Like, when did you get the idea? Were you just like, I know that you mentioned, it was the brokest you've ever been. Were you in a place where you were like, I just need a creative outlet and I need to transition?
Kind of, yeah. I had started my content creation journey 10 years ago with a fitness blog called The Balance Berry. And I've been doing that for about 4 years. And by 2018, I was just super sick of it. I was really burnt out. I was also just experiencing a lot of personal lows. I was in a job that was really toxic. I was being horribly underpaid. experiencing a lot of anxiety around that. I was going through a really bad breakup at the time. I was super sick of the fitness content that I was doing. And, my blog and my content were just never that successful, even though I'd put so much work into it and I was really frustrated with it. And so I had decided to sunset the Balanced Berry, and I thought that I was just going to stop with content altogether. So I hadn't been posting on social media. I wasn't blogging. I wasn't really doing anything. I was just working at my terrible job at the time. And I was sitting at work one day. I was a social media manager for a startup at that time. And I got the idea, like it just popped into my head, start a podcast, name it Balanced Black Girl, talk to Black women in wellness. That was the kind of initial premise of the show. And it's evolved a bit since then. And literally the second I got the idea, I was like, okay, this is it. We're doing this.
I'm curious why wellness for you? Like, I had Lyme disease like, as a kid. I was 14 years old. It literally opened my eyes to health, wellness, nutrition, herbs, yoga, Ayurveda. Did you have one of those moments, or what brought you to health and wellness?
No, I actually got into wellness while I was working my first corporate internship the summer between my junior and senior year at college. That was my first taste of like, I don't think corporate America is for me, but I didn't know what else was. And I just hated sitting at a desk all day and was just super exhausted. And I was like, I'm 20 years old. Why am I unable to stay awake throughout the day? So I started getting into exercise and trying to eat better just so I could have energy to make it through my horribly boring work days. And then my love for wellness just snowballed from there.
I feel like wellness is a gateway drug to
It
more
is.
wellness,
It
right?
is.
I
Yes.
think once we finally get that taste of like, oh, there's a different way to do this, we can kind of like move in that direction. So, gosh, I love that story so much. And what I love about podcasts is when I was even personally going through is something similar where I was in a corporate job and I was super frustrated. The thing that actually turned me on to wellness and lifestyle was podcasts. Everyone kept telling me they were listening to true crime. This was like back in 2017. And I was like, ew, if that's what podcasting is, like, I don't want to do that. And then found Lacey Phillips' show. Yeah. Yeah. And I just like dove right on in. Was there a show for you that kind of was that similar like gateway drug, I guess? And then you're like, oh, podcasting is perfect for me.
It was, yeah. The very first podcast that I got really into was the Chalene Show by Chalene Johnson. I had also had a background in fitness, and so I was like a big fan of Chalene and like her workout programs back in the day. She was kind of like the first person on Instagram to really be Fitspo, so long ago. And I remember when she launched her show, that was when I started listening to podcasts. And then through her show, it introduced me to other kind of OG podcasters like Amy Porterfield and Sean Stevenson and Lewis Howes and Pat Flynn. And it just kind of like opened up that whole world for me. And a few years later, I feel like everybody got into podcasts because of Serial, kind of that true crime thing that you were talking about. And I was thinking like, okay, first of all, y'all are late. Second of all, there's so many other types of podcasts that are so much better for you. I'm such a true crime hater. I think it is the most low vibrational, terrible thing you can do for your mental health, and I refuse to consume it. So I'm always like, true crime, like stop. Why would you do that?
I feel
I
very similarly.
Yeah, literally same thing. I have friends that like listen to it on the regular and I'm like, absolutely not. I want to go on a walk and listen to my wellness podcast and like get inspired and like smile. So, I mean, to each their own, you know?
I am so curious how you did say you have a social media background. So at what point? So you're starting this podcast, you have the name, you feel inspired, you're like, okay, I'm gonna do this thing. You get the tech, you get the mic. At what point did the social media following, did that follow it? Were you already active using that same account? Like, did they go hand in hand in the growth?
Yeah, I would say they went hand in hand. By that time, I had kind of a decent Instagram presence. I had maybe like 10,000 followers on my Instagram. I started a second Instagram for Balanced Black Girl, like for the show itself. And I would say since then, both have kind of grown in tandem with the podcast. So I did have a little bit of an audience beforehand, but having the podcast has definitely helped grow my audience from there.
So when you started, And this is something that a lot of our audience members have dealt with or struggled with. What do you see? What have you seen in terms of evolution? And was there a time where you were looking at the numbers or like what was your growth journey? What did that look like? What strategies did you use? What like didn't work? I would just love to hear your perspective on this, even for our audience.
Yeah, something that I'm learning in real time is I had this misconception that you work towards something, you grind, you hustle, you grow for a while, and then you get to this point where you make it and you're like, cool, that's here. This is my audience for forever. They're going to stick around forever. This is great. I reached this point and I'm just going to stay here and I've made it. And what I've learned is that that's just not the case. You're always trying to grow, you're always evolving, you're always doing different things because these mediums are constantly changing. What worked in podcasting when I started in 2018 is so drastically different than what is working now because the platforms are different, distribution is different. We as people, we've all been through a global pandemic and however many like traumatic world events, like people are different. So you never are at a point where you're like, okay, I've grown, I'm done. It's a constant evolution of what's working right now. And if something's not working right now, then how do I pivot? And, I'm in one of those seasons right now where it's like what was working for my show for a few years that helped me grow, 2 to 3 years ago isn't really working right now. And so I'm back at the drawing board of experimentation and learning how to embrace that it's always going to be an experiment. It's always something that you're working towards, I think takes a lot of pressure off of trying to grow.
It's a really good reminder because I do think it's easy for us to put whether it's a show, whether it's a person on a pedestal, and we're like, oh shit, they made it. They have a huge following. They're bringing big people on their show. They're doing cool things. And we say, oh, that's so far away, or that's where I want to get. And then it's going to be okay. And then it's going to be cool. And then life's going to be smooth sailing. But the reality is, like, we're always experiencing lots of different ups and downs and sideways steps at every turn in our journey, whether we're here or here. And it's all metaphorical anyway. Like, we're all just doing our best and we're learning as we go. So, as someone who just like experiences lots of things and tries things out and some work and some don't, I think it's the best teacher of all because think about all the things that you've learned through that process and through that journey.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. And I realized that it's really all about the learning that you have through those experiences, not from getting to any particular destination. And it's a hard lesson. I'm still learning it right now and I'm resistant and it's hard and upsetting at times, but it's part of the process.
I love that. So, when we're thinking about like speaking of podcast growth and not looking at the numbers and looking at the numbers, what has kind of kept you stable throughout this journey of having a podcast and like what's kind of been your, I guess, shining star,
Your guiding light.
your guiding light?
I think it might just be my own stubbornness and like refusal to give up, even when it's hard and frustrating.
I feel that so hard. Actually, Bridget and I feel that so hard.
So
We're like,
stubborn.
we will
Yep.
see this till the end.
Yep. Until I decide that I'm done with this, it is going to happen.
Yeah, but that kind of resilience is like really, I think, what helps entrepreneurs in general get to where they want to go. And what I find is when we do it, when we decide to stick with something, we actually open doors for other opportunities to come in that we never saw come. It's like the classic like manifestation. You manifest one thing, but it doesn't look anything like what we thought it was going to look like when we actually get there. Um, so when you are looking at guests, I would love to hear like how you kind of decide who you want to speak to. And has that, you mentioned that it's kind of evolved over time. Has it evolved because your interests have changed or like what did that look like for you?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely evolved because my interests have changed for sure. I would say earlier in my podcast journey, I was almost like a talent scout. Like I've had so many guests in the past who maybe my podcast was their first experience being on a podcast, or maybe they had kind of an up and coming or growing or emerging platform. And then after going on my show, they sell out a program and, my audience goes and follows them and they build a business out of it, or then they get put on the radar to go on even bigger podcasts and that helps them blow up. And for a long time, my show was kind of the catalyst for my guests in a lot of ways, which on one hand was so cool to be a part of that. And then on the other hand, I was like, wow, my show is literally serving everybody but me. And how can I get a little bit more out of this? Because podcasting is expensive. It took me a very long time to monetize it all. And I was like, I am spending thousands of dollars each month to keep this podcast going for other people's businesses to blow up. And I am not seeing any return on my investment. And so my interests have shifted a little bit from like discovering people more so to bringing on people that I really admire and am excited to learn from. And so it's really now an opportunity for me to get to be a student and to get to have candid conversations with people that I really admire. And, back in the day, I used to accept a lot of pitches, and now it's pretty rare that I accept a pitch. Honestly, most of our guests are people who I choose to invite on because I think that they have a really unique story or a perspective that I would love to learn more about and share with my audience. And so it's definitely changed. It's now a bit more of an intuitive process. And yeah, there's not really a much of a rhyme or reason to it.
I appreciate that because sometimes this is something that Lydia and I talk about. When we started, we have a PR and media company. So we started just bringing writers on at big magazines so that they can share with our audience, like, what works, what pitches are actually landing, what subject lines work. And I think what we've realized over time is like, we love lifestyle. We love the wellness content. We love talking about what is your human design. Like, we want to have the guests on where we can just go there with that person. And I guess I'd love your thoughts on this because when you start a show, it is helpful to have a little bit of a, whether we call it a niche or a target or something specific so that the audience can be like, oh, yeah, that's the show that I go to for this. So what do you think around starting shows? Like, should the hosts just be themselves and have whoever they want on, or should they have a focus until they grow an audience to a level where the listeners will listen no matter who they have on?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's something that I think about a lot. I think it's a combination. I think a mistake that I made, kind of that I alluded to earlier, is I was so focused on everybody else for so many years. What do the listeners want? What does the guest want? Well, this person needs help selling their book, and we need, I wish that I would have inserted a little bit more of myself into the show earlier because I reached a point of burnout because again, my show, I'm putting thousands of hours of labor into it and thousands of dollars of my own money every month. And I'm feeling drained by it. I feel like it has nothing to do with me and like it's not serving me in any way. And of course, we do this to support an audience, but there has to be something in it for the host too. And so I think everybody kind of has to find that sweet spot for themselves of how can this be mutually beneficial for both me and the people that I'm working with, whether that's the listener, whether that's the guest, whether that's other podcasters that I work with. How can this be kind of mutually supportive of everybody involved?
I heard a lot of different podcast hosts that have said this before. They've talked about how their show is a launch pad for others. And as much as they love individuals and storytelling and hearing other people and being that amazing launch pad for different business owners, it does become draining when you're like creating something and you're like, what's in it for me? Like, what am I doing here? And Bridget and I always joke around. I think it's Gabby Bernstein, but it's like that. When is the bounce back period from
Oh,
getting
it's
off
the
track?
comeback rate. She calls
The
it the
comeback.
comeback rate.
Mm.
Okay, the comeback rate. Yeah. So I feel like when we're coming down a path of whatever it is, like a business venture, podcast, we somehow get like kind of taken off course. And then we get to a point where we're like, wait, how do we bring it back to ourselves? So I give you a lot of credit for like redirecting and being like, hey, I actually love speaking to people. I love this show. So how can I make it fulfilling for me again? So I would love to hear what types of business owners or what types of conversations are you having now on your show?
Yeah, it's a lot of things that are more candid, but also more conversations that are rooted in joy. I think sometimes the hard stories and the tough stuff can be really sexy and dramatic and get a lot of clicks and a lot of listens. And I also found that I was having a really hard time holding so much space for so many other people all the time, that when the content was really heavy, the audience would respond in ways that were really heavy. And I would get emails and DMs of just this really heavy stuff. And on one hand, I'm so honored that people feel safe enough to come to me with those things. And also, I'm only one person. And when I have hundreds of people or thousands of people expecting me to hold their stuff, and I don't really have support to hold mine, it can be really, really hard. And so I think one of the biggest pivots I've made in my show is just more stories about joy and more uplifting, fun, positive conversations, because the opposite, it was really, really hard.
Yeah, I could imagine holding space for everybody. And these are the things we don't think about, right? Like once we get the feedback and realize like how things are shifting, you see your audience responding, you're like, oh my gosh, how did this happen? We need to redirect. So these are great points. Thank you for our audience to even just understand if they're thinking about starting a show or if they've gone through this themselves. This is amazing for us too. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Bridget and I are obsessed with all things joy. We actually, speaking of human design, we had somebody look at our charts, like overlap them. And
Oh my
apparently
God.
it's supposed to be fun. Like our
We're just
charts
meant to
are,
have fun together.
which
That's
is
perfect.
right. Isn't that so fun? So I
Yeah.
love that we're on the same page. Speaking of fun things that have happened, I, as you know, am a fan personally. And I was looking at your Instagram and I saw, I pitched you, I forget what happened, but I think you or a team member had responded and said that you were transitioning. And I was like, ooh, like I wonder what's going on. And then I saw that you got signed on to Dear Media. So first off, congratulations. That's such a big deal. We are big fans of all Dear Media shows. And how has that kind of transitioned to the way that you do things? I know you mentioned you go in studio now. Was that their choice or do they provide those things for you? I would love to kind of get behind the scenes of what it looks like to be associated with a big company like Dear Media.
Yeah, yeah. So I joined Dear Media last year in 2023, and it has just been such a like positive partnership and has been really, really wonderful to have as a creator. Um, I had been doing my show independently for about 4 years by the time they reached out expressing interest in my show. And I had had other podcast networks, reach out with interest to acquire the show. And there was just never a fit that really felt like, this is a good home for me, or this is a good home for my show. Um, and so when I ended up joining Dear Media, it was just very clear that it's a very creator friendly organization, which makes sense because it's founded by creators. And so through that partnership, it's really allowed me to get out of the weeds a bit and to focus more on being a host. And so I'm not managing things like the editing of my show and the publishing of my show and what's happening on the back end and placing ads and negotiating back and forth with sponsors. They have a team that supports all of that. And so I get to just manage the content of my show at a high level. So, I still oversee all of the topics and all of the things that make my show, and I get to just show up and host. And so I do think having more support on the back end has made me a better host, because I'm doing so much less of the admin and I'm able to just show up more and be the face of my show in ways that I wasn't able to before.
And so many people forget how much goes into running a podcast.
So
Like
much.
so much,
Yeah.
so much. So I feel like you get to just be in your element now. It's like most of us start a podcast because we love having conversations. We love asking people questions. We love the back and forth, like the funness of it. And there is something with editing the videos, promoting the content, like all those little nitty-gritty things that come with it. You don't think about that in the beginning. So now you get to be in your lane. What are you like excited about talking about these days? Like, is it still lifestyle? Is it wellness? Is it makeup? Like, what's just fun and exciting for you?
Yeah, I was actually meeting with my assistant earlier because we were mapping out our summer episodes. And this summer, I'm going to be kind of returning to more solos, similar to what we were talking about earlier. I kind of reached a point where I think I got a little lost in the sauce with having a lot of guests. And I've had amazing guests, especially over the past few months, truly women who I admire and look up to so much. And I also have to remember, as a listener, I tend to love listening to the hosts. Like, that's what people return to the show for. And so I realized, like, oh, I'm getting in another season where I'm kind of hiding behind the guests a little bit. So it's time for me to come out and like be myself again so that people can remember who I am and why they listen. And so I'm excited to be coming out with some more solo episodes. Also excited to dive a little bit more into entrepreneurship because I left my corporate job at the end of last year. I've been focusing on the show full time, and then also starting to explore other business ventures that I'm hoping to be launching over the next year, just other brands, other companies that complement Balanced Black Girl, but are a little bit different, just to kind of expand there. And so I'm really excited to bring the audience along for that process as I kind of move into the next phase of my career as more of a founder. So yeah, it's a little bit more of bringing people behind the scenes to learn a little bit more about who I am. And I'm kind of taking a step back from being like all knowing Les, who is your big sister, who has all the answers. Recently in therapy, I learned that that is actually not good for me. That is a trauma response. So I'm trying to have my work not revolve around my trauma responses and am focusing a little bit more on letting loose and not feeling like I need to have the answers for everyone's problems, including mine. So it's going to be a little bit of a shift from a content perspective, but one that I'm looking forward to.
Congratulations. This is so amazing. Congratulations. And what's funny is I think a lot of podcast hosts forget that people come back for us. People come back for the one who created it. And I am that person that cannot wait for a solo episode. I'm sitting on the back end and I'm like, what are they doing? How are they like creating this? Like, what's happening in their day to day? I want to know their morning routine. I'm just so inspired by somebody who started something amazing that I personally love. So, when it comes to solo episodes, how do you come up with content of what you want to share? Or do you have some, things you could drop for us, just like a little teasers for what's to come?
You want to know what's so funny? And this is like a real talk behind the scenes moment. So a few days ago, I had an interview with a guest booked. And unfortunately, that guest just got the wrong address and didn't make it to the studio in time. And I was like, okay, we're still paying for the studio time. I can't waste it. I'm walking out of here with an episode. And so I just sat and riffed solo. I had no intention of doing that. I went there prepared to do an interview. And I ended up just totally speaking straight from the heart about just like a life update, where I'm at, where my mental health is at. And I find that the episodes where you are solo, just speaking from the heart, the audience tends to resonate with those the most. And so I have definitely had some solo episodes where it's very scripted and I have certain points that I want to hit. But I find that the times where I just sit down and just talk and just let the audience in to what's going on tend to be the episodes that resonate with people the most.
Humans love the other humans. I think that's what it comes back to at the end of the day. And it's like people buy from people. And especially in this tech driven world, we're the connection, like the human to the human who's experienced similar things. They might be, moving through some challenges in their life, or they might be excited about something. And that's like what connects us. So I love this message. I am team less for, this next chapter of your life and what you're excited to bring to the world. I had a question for you, but it left my mind. So Lydia probably has something else.
I just love that you talked about how you created. I love how I was like, oh, I have a content idea. And then you were like, actually, I spoke from the heart. Cause I think when it comes to content ideas for solo episodes, we tend to, get very nervous about what to say, what's going to resonate with the audience. So bringing it back to remembering that they're coming for us and it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Like the audience is not going to care. And whether you talk about your morning routine or you just talk about where you're at. And to Bridget's point, when we are sharing from a perspective of just being a human being, like that's what we want to hear. We want to hear like the raw, uncut. So, what Bridget said, like, I am so here for it. I cannot wait to listen. So So Les, where can we find all of your stuff? Please give us like the lowdown and if there's anything that we need to look out for.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see. I mean, most consistently would be the podcast,
Yeah.
Balanced Black Girl. We have new episodes that come out every Tuesday, which is really, really fun wherever you get your podcasts. So Apple, Spotify. I also do video episodes on YouTube now, which has been really fun. We've been doing that for the past probably like 6 months. So that's been a new medium. If y'all are interested more so in me as a person and like the wellnessy things that I'm up to, then I share that a lot on social media. I'm at Balanced Less on Instagram and TikTok. Something else that's fun. Oh, I just released merch for the podcast for the first time, which is really, really fun. So if people listen to the podcast, something that I talk about is being in my successful era, which is basically just getting back to basics for wellness and lifestyle habits to help me be my most successful self. And so we recently launched Successful Era merch to like help everybody be in their successful era. So we have little crew necks and t-shirts and coffee mugs that are really fun.
We have been merch obsessed. So I love that you were saying that. I'm like, I want something that says success era. Like I'm
Yeah,
into that. So I will be heading over to your merch section of your site.
perfect. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you so much for being here today. Like this was one of my favorite conversations. So you heard it on the pod.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It was a
That was
pleasure.
amazing.
Yeah. Thank you everybody for listening to another episode of Visibility Era, the podcast.